Hello and welcome. This video really builds on my previous videos on the Enlightenment and the revolutions of colonists and enslaved peoples in the Americas. So if you haven't checked those out yet, you may want to. One of the historical developments that we need to be familiar with is that the rise and diffusion of Enlightenment ideas that question established traditions in all areas of life often preceded revolutions and rebellions against existing governments. So, in the wake of these old traditions, what new traditions emerged to link people, states, and groups together? Enter the age of the isms. In English, we use the suffix ism to indicate a belief or an ideology. So, for example, racism is the ideology that some races are better than others. But we aren't here to talk about racism today. Well, not really. Instead, we're here to talk about movements inspired by the Enlightenment. A revolution or rebellion against an existing government that we have yet to discuss is the French Revolution. The French Revolution begins 6 years following the conclusion of the American Revolution, and this, my friends, is not a coincidence. Louis XVI, new to his throne and eager to continue the French monarchy's traditions of overspending and competing with Great Britain, commits to the support of the American colonists' war against the British, even though he really doesn't have the money to do so. But he sends troops and supplies across the Atlantic anyway, enabling the ragtag colonists to defeat the British in 1783. While the French troops are over there, they are deeply entrenched with the colonists' discussions of Enlightenment thought, natural rights, and self-government in opposition to absolute monarchy. Liberal aristocrats like the Marquis de Lafayette, seen here, work side by side with the founding fathers and return to France eager to reform. It's important to note that when I use the term liberal here, I'm meaning in the 19th century sense, where conservative meant someone who was supportive of absolute monarchy as the only real option, and liberal was its opposite, in that it supported increased representation and liberty for middle-class, educated men. In the late 1780s, France had a real crisis on its hands, and it seemed as though reforming the monarchy with a constitution to check its power was the only real way out. Louis, in a way over his head, asks for help from a proto-parliament type institution called the Estates General, where representatives from the different social classes meet to advise the king. The first estate, the clergy, the people of the church, are uninterested in reform because it would jeopardize their privileges. And the second estate, the nobles, are also mostly uninterested in reform because they are just doing fine. So thank you, but no thank you. But the third estate, the new merchant middle class, or what we might call the bourgeoisie, who is actually paying all the taxes, they're ready to write a constitution. Eventually, they elect the Marquis de Lafayette, who has regular contact with Thomas Jefferson, to write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, seen here on the right. Unfortunately, this summer is also extremely hot, and there's a famine, meaning that the people of France are very, very hungry. And so the peasants are also really upset, and they trigger the storming of the Bastille, a prison for political prisoners, which on July 14th, 1789, starts the revolution. Louis is forced to accept the Constitution, which he does so begrudgingly but publicly. Privately, however, the anti-monarchy sentiments of this movement not only bothers him, but also bothers the rest of Europe's monarchs, and together they secretly plot to overthrow the revolution. When this is found out, it radicalizes the revolution. What started as a movement by the wealthy merchant middle class and more liberal aristocrats to reform an incompetent absolute monarchy quickly becomes a challenge to the entire established Western system of government. If you recall that we needed to know that, quote, discontent with monarchies and imperial rule encouraged the development of systems of government in various ideologies, including democracy and 19th century liberalism, well, buckle up, because it's actually going to take us a while to get there, especially in France. Following the betrayal of the revolution by Louis and the rest of the European monarchs, the revolution enters a phase known as the Reign of Terror, where a political party known as the Jacobins, led by a man named Maximilien Robespierre, rewrite France. They start the calendar at year zero. They rename the months. They persecute nobles, in fact, executing tens of thousands by guillotine for being, quote, enemies of the revolution. Robespierre eventually goes too far, and he himself is executed, ushering in the return to normalcy led by Napoleon Bonaparte. Here is where we get introduced to another one of our isms, nationalism. In fact, we need to know that nationalism also became a major force shaping the historical development of states and empires. How do we define who belongs to a nation? Even more, how do we convince people that they belong and that they should feel so attached to the idea of a nation that they're willing to fight and die to defend it? This is a big part of nationalism, where I like to think that borders combined with belief. In France, this sense of French identity was strengthened throughout the Revolution and can be illustrated by the tricolore, the blue, white, and red flag, and their national anthem, the Marseillaise. As the Prussian and Austrian armies closed in on the newly born French Republic, the armies of the French sang out, "Sacred love of the fatherland, lead, supporting our avenging arms, liberty, cherished liberty, fight with thy defenders. Under our flags may victory hurry to thy manly accents, so that thy expiring enemies see thy triumph and our glory." And so here we can kind of see how they're using song, how they're using ritual in order to create this sense of belief, right? And it's easy to see in the pride that the French have in their language, their culture, their food, and their art. And much of this, it's important to remember, is born in the fires of the Revolution and the ensuing Napoleonic Wars. In the 19th century, we also see nationalism start to become the way that people define themselves in relation to the states and empires they live in. Whereas before, they might define themselves in terms of village, family, clan, or religion, with new ideas and technology like print culture, newspapers, and eventually transportation technologies like the railroad, we actually need a new and maybe even broader way to define ourselves. For example, Hungarians start to question why they're part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire instead of their own state. People in the Balkan Peninsula, let's move that down here. People in the Balkan Peninsula question the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire. In this image, we can see the different Balkan states. They're attacking this like serpent dragon thing of the Ottomans. Mexicans start to embrace their history as inheritors of the great native empire of the Aztecs and the Mayans. All of these are really great examples of 19th century nationalism. Nationalism, though, inherently creates what historian and philosopher Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities. The community in this sense is imagined because we aren't really geographically in community, like really in community, with many people that we claim to be joined to. It requires us to buy into this abstract idea, quote, of nationhood. We need to know, however, like it says here, that these newly imagined national communities often linked this new national identity with the borders of the state, and in some cases, nationalists challenged boundaries or sought unification of fragmented regions. Calls for national unification emerged in the 19th century in both Germany and Italy, where charismatic and powerful leaders like Bismarck, shown here, and Garibaldi in Italy emerged to forcibly unite the independent states, the kind of small kingdoms, or princedoms rather, that became Germany and Italy as we know them today. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into more detail than that, and if you're in my class, we'll work closely with Bismarck and German unification because it happens to have very deep repercussions for 20th century history. The echoes of the Enlightenment challenged the traditional political and gender hierarchies too, as demands for women's suffrage and other rights for women emerged. Mary Wollstonecraft, an early first-wave feminist in Britain, wrote the book A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, in the era of revolution. Her arguments center on the idea that women deserve education if they are to be good mothers who raise good citizens and helpful companions for their husbands. This, quote, maternal feminism continued to focus on women's roles, their kind of unique roles as mothers, as the reason for justifying their need for rights. Fun fact, Mary Wollstonecraft is also the mother of Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein. Olympe de Gouges in France and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States, however, will push feminism more into the realm of a demand for suffrage or voting rights. In both of their works, they take the foundational documents of their nations and add "and women" everywhere where men are mentioned. In the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, Stanton even adopts the grievance structure of the Declaration of Independence when she says things like, quote, "He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice." Look, here I am at the church where the convention was held. Look, it's me and Mrs. Stein. Look, more Mrs. Stein. Here we are inside. and I'm so excited. Right here, the first Women's Rights Convention was held. Most feminists in the 19th century who actively demanded the right to vote did so out of an interest in the reform movements that the Enlightenment also gave rise to. In fact, we do need to know that Enlightenment ideas and religious ideals influenced various reform movements. These reform movements contributed to the expansion of rights, as seen in expanded suffrage, the abolition of slavery, and the end of serfdom. First wave feminists are deeply involved in movements in the United States and Britain to abolish slavery. And both Enlightenment thought concerning the natural rights of all humans and religious ideas about morality or the lack thereof of enslavement contribute as well. Lucretia Mott, for example, seen here on the right, a prominent first-wave feminist and abolitionist, was a Quaker, which is a Christian denomination that actively continues to, enslavement. Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu saw slavery as a violation of the laws of nature. And even Thomas Jefferson, who, had he never been president, would have been famous as an American Enlightenment thinker, called it a moral depravity, despite the fact that he enslaved hundreds of people over his lifetime, including having a relationship, probably non-consensual, and children with a woman whom he enslaved. The tension between Enlightenment thought and the institution of slavery was not lost on Enlightenment thinkers and continued to build active opposition to it from those who were formerly enslaved, like Frederick Douglass. Oh, and white male abolitionists in Europe and the United States, and like I stated, feminists on both sides of the Atlantic. Of course, while the slave trade is abolished in Britain in 1807, slavery as an institution continued in the British Empire until 1834. We know from American history that the early history of the Republic is dominated by debates over the spread of slavery until finally it erupted in the Civil War, when slavery is abolished and its abolition is enshrined in the Constitution in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Slavery will not be outlawed in Brazil until 1888, a testament to how much the sugar industry relied on the labor of enslaved people. In this same vein, serfdom, which was still a holdout in Russia, was finally abolished in 1861. Side note, the pressures of industrialization and also a very, very embarrassing loss in the Crimean War is what triggers the Tsar to abolish serfdom in 1861. Despite the moral and intellectual arguments against the institution of slavery, a primary driving factor behind its abolition was also economic. Enslaved people are not very productive because they resent their condition and work in ways to subtly undermine what they're doing. They are not a mobile or free workforce. The industrial economy that will emerge in the 19th century, though, requires a mobile and free workforce, and therefore enslaved labor does not fulfill its needs. Finally, we need to talk about expanded suffrage. Property requirements for voting in the United States are removed during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s for white men. Black men on paper got the right to vote after the Civil War, except they were often prevented from doing so. And in Britain, property requirements for voting for white British men are lessened in the 1830s and again in the 1860s, which we can kind of see indicated here in these images. And so we can continue to see the effects and ripples of the Enlightenment spill out for decades to come. Thanks for watching.